The world and Europe in particular are not short of challenges. Last month, Johan Rockström, the chief scientist of the Potsdam Climate Institute, announced that the safe boundary of the seventh of 9 critical planetary systems has also been crossed. These 9 systems regulate the framework conditions humanity needs to thrive. Crossing means getting outside the safe zone. Many are now moving towards irreversible tipping points. The 7th boundary that we just crossed is ocean acidification. It is a result of having absorbed most of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions. The oceans represent some 70% of our planet's surface, and thus they also absorb the lion's share of anthropogenic heat. The combination of acidity and higher temperatures means bleaching of coral reefs, migration of species, stronger hurricanes, Arctic melting, and a slowing of AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is the current that distributes the heat on our planet and hence is an important part of our climate system. Big planetary systems go through their motions with a lot of inertia. On the one hand, that means slow, but on the other hand, it means with a lot of momentum. Going past the tipping point therefore means passing beyond an irreversible boundary. Whilst 200 years is a long time for humans, for planetary system evolution it is a microsecond. Yet, the past 200 years of humanity's energy metabolism has been like an explosion. It increased 40-fold from 5,000 terawatt-hours in the beginning of the 19th century to almost 200,000 terawatt-hours now. Pure J-curves only exist in theoretical mathematics. Eventually, all J-curves become S-curves or even convex curves. Population in the meantime increased by a factor of 8, so the average energy per person increased by a factor of 5. However, the richest 10% of the world population, largely OECD countries and the richest strata in developing nations, are responsible for 50% of all global emissions, representing also their share of the energy used on their behalf. The IPCC convention to measure emissions by territory rather than by consumption means that the OECD share in official statistics is underestimated and declining. However, 1/3 of EU's claimed emission reductions since 1990 reference year in fact were merely emission relocations and therefore not really reductions at all. In 2018 we proposed TEX, True Energy and Carbon Statistics, an idea to report emissions by causality, i.e. consumption, instead of by locality of production, even though the latter is of course easier to measure. We're proud that 2 years ago this idea was adopted by the European Parliament as CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which means reattributing offshore emissions for the European market to the European footprint, as they were triggered in the first place by EU demand and came back in the EU in the form of trade semi-finished products. And that is good, because it's good for a level playing field for EU industry who are not threatened by fake competition or false competition. It's for the protection of EU jobs, and it is good for the climate. Because CBAM gives also an incentive to non-EU overseas producers to produce cleaner, as this will give them a discount when they bring in the product for CBAM. This is a good example of how EU soft power influence reaches well outside Europe. Based on this more realistic way of attributing CO2 emissions, it is safe to say that the EU goal of net zero by 2050 is unlikely to be reached anytime soon. For the world as a whole, even less so. Net zero is that point on the curve where things stop getting worse. However, due to inertia of climate as a complex adaptive system, there will be lag time effects before CO2 concentrations and its greenhouse gas effects will start to diminish. So the climate effects of the carbon pulse we triggered 200 years ago will stay with us much longer before things start to improve. Whether a return to safe Holocene boundary conditions in which we thrived for the past 10,000 years is at all possible remains to be seen. Due to the tipping points in multiple systems, this is not the most likely outcome. Fact is, as Sir David King, chairman of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, warned at the end of a podium interview I did with him at the European Business Summit, what we do in the next few years will determine the fate of humanity for the next few thousand years. That unplanned closing remark reverberated throughout all the subsequent panels, who referred back to this single warning. With the 1.5 degrees limit already being breached, several top research institutes now point to the very real possibility that 4 degrees climate warming may be reached this century, moving us from Holocene conditions clearly into Anthropocene conditions. Whilst this latter term, Anthropocene, was coined by a Dutch chemistry Nobel Prize laureate Paul Crutzen, it means era made by humans, but it is not suitable for humans. In order to move back into the safe Holocene conditions, an energy transition, mitigation, is indispensable. But it will also require a societal transition, adaptation. However, because we keep talking but failing to act, we lost already much time. So whilst both are indispensable, these two measures alone can no longer turn the course we are on in a sufficient way. Due to both physical and political inertia and the non-linear or even exponential character developments, changes a meta approach is needed. Mitigation, adaptation and beyond. I will explain a bit later about this beyond dimension. Let's first look at 3 cases before ending with Europe, because the nature of energy transition varies a lot by region. Australia, for example, is replacing coal generation gradually by wind, solar, storage and gas, resulting in significant reductions in domestic emissions. But at the same time, Australia remains a major exporter of fossil fuels. Coal and gas exports now amount to roughly 3.8 times the country's own primary energy use. Under IPCC territorial accounting rules, the emissions from these exported fuels are attributed to the importing country, in this case China, and China presents yet another dynamic. It dominates the manufacturing and export of renewable technologies, but relies heavily on fossil fuels to power this production. This results in embodied emissions, embedded in the exports, attributed to China, even though they would not be manufactured if it weren't for the demand in export markets. These examples highlight that energy transition is not simply a matter of switching fuels within a single country. It is a complex, globally interconnected process shaped by trade, mining and industrial capacity. While some energy transition progress is real, it exists alongside persistent global dependence on fossil fuels. And any narrative of transition must account for both. The US recently chose not to connect a nearly completed offshore wind park. They follow a Drain America First course, increasing the domestic production, including shale reserves, thus exacerbating their CO2 footprint. Whilst Russian sanctions are understandable, replacing pipeline-delivered Russian gas with much more expensive LNG-shipped gas across the Atlantic does neither improve the CO2 balance for the world nor the competitiveness of European industry. Europe faces arguably the greatest predicament. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in her September State of the Union in the European Parliament in Strasbourg, rolled back some of the Green Deal ambitions from her first term and proposed a clean deal instead. Mario Draghi's report criticized the EU's lagging productivity, but IMD's World Competitiveness Report shows 8 European countries amongst the world's 15 most competitive economics. As a banker and US-trained economist, he had ignored that the higher charges and taxes may drain productivity, but they increase societal services, Medicare and well-being. But neither explicitly mentioned the following 6 features of Europe which are important to consider as they plan their transition. Europe is still the biggest single market, perhaps not for much longer number one, but still attractive. Europe is the smallest continent, and those of you that have been to Australia may have seen this postcard in which they proudly project Europe inside Australia with plenty of space left and right over. Europe is also the most densely populated continent, and after Japan, the fastest aging continent. Furthermore, it is the fastest warming populated continent. Only Antarctica, which is by the way bigger than Australia, warms even faster. Furthermore, it is the resource poorest continent, which has to do of course with the size of the continent, and with the exception of talent, perhaps if we develop that better, this is another weak point, and the CRMA, the Critical Raw Materials Act itself cannot change this. And finally, Europe remains the most trade, import-export dependent economy in the world. So a stable world is of great importance for a continent so intimately interwoven with the rest of the world. In a time where attacking is more expensive than defense, there is peace and stability. Now we live in an era where attacking is cheaper than defending. Think of 20,000 euro drones that need to be taken down by a 3 million euro Patriot rocket. Thus the Manhattan scientists, who since 1947 have kept a doomsday clock representing how close we are to war, they've now put the needle at 90 seconds before midnight. Never before has it been this close. Against this backdrop, we are proposing a transformational platform, Arise. Resilience Innovation for Sustainable Europe. A soft launch was actually moderated by 4 times former Prime Minister Jan-Peter Balkenende in May in Villa Margese. Arise is an action platform that identifies, enables and supports truly breakthrough innovations necessary to scale the energy and resource transition. It consists of a multi-pillared arch and a number of vertical pillars. These come in 2 categories: system enablers and innovation drivers. On the left, you see the enabler pillars. On the right, you see the first innovation driver pillars that we have identified. 3 so far: NMC, new molecularity, biogenesis and thorium. I'll briefly explain later. Then you see the enabling pillars. These enable the innovation drivers by either giving them time to effect or funding. Direct climate cooling is not a solution for climate change, but it is not merely a measure tackling symptoms either. Rather, it is an enabler for measures that tackle the causes by giving those measures the indispensable time to have effect, which measures cannot have if we continue in a matter of decades to a 4-degree world with all the consequences this entails. While some call direct climate cooling a moral hazard because they believe it will reduce the impetus for action in the area of mitigation and adaptation, the reality of political inertia and physical momentum means that the real moral hazard is to delay climate cooling, as it will expose humanity to more heat stress and condemn humanity to longer and stronger cooling measures, possibly with methods that are less controllable in duration, location and rate of cooling than some of the antibiotic equivalent methods that should be deployed before only invasive surgery methods will be sufficient. The second enabler is cubics, or net nature positive projects. This is a new, innovative, IFRS recognized new immaterial asset class where net nature positive projects using this new cubic financing model can become sustainable outcomes enabled by innovative financing tools. The total project cost, for example, is split up in cubics, each representing a cubical fractional share of the project. Companies can then put this as an asset on the balance sheet and enjoy tax deductibility and depreciation. Blockchain tracks the bioscore metrics to monitor and verify the net nature positive impact. Cooling is slowly beginning to dawn on people, but nonlinearity and inertia effects are remaining complex concepts to grasp. meaning that what the consequence of inaction will be are hardly talked about or poorly understood. As Alfred Bartlett famously said, the greatest weakness of humanity is its inability to understand the exponential function. We are now tackling exponential challenges with linear thinking. That is like not turning the steering wheel of a car when approaching a curve. Some criticize direct climate cooling as moral hazard. Whilst their concern is understandable, they fear it may take away the impetus for mitigation and adaptation. In reality, it is a reality-blind argument because only all three, mitigation, adaptation and beyond, together can preserve Holocene framework conditions. Now let's talk about some of the innovation drivers we've identified. The first one is neomolecularity. What it means is it is a cutting-edge breakthrough invention to make hydrocarbon components that are in 88% of all the products we use today out of CO2. Being under NDA, non-disclosure agreement, I cannot disclose too much about this other than saying it does not involve hydrogen, which would make a green premium necessary for the final product. Atoms make up everything, so don't trust them. NMC is a sophisticated electrochemical carbon capture and usage concept that can produce hydrocarbons such as aromas, medicines, perfumes, plastics, etc. from point CO2 emissions, which then are waste output, but thanks to this process they can get converted into CO2 value input. The fact this can be done at virgin fossil cost parity means this is truly a breakthrough with huge potential. So not decarbonization, carbon has been a building block of life for 500 million years, but defossilization. The second innovation we identified is biogenesis. This is a method to use carbon and graphite from forestry waste to make biomineral composites. For example, electric cables made from carbon, nanotube copper composites that are twice as conductive and use half the amount of copper needed for normal cables. In view of the footprint of copper mining and the huge demand increase due to electrification, this would be a welcome alternative both for climate and for indigenous people living in the areas where these mine excavations take place. Many observers think renewables will continue to get cheaper because they wrongly believe that extractive processes follow the traditional experience cost curves. In reality, extractive production costs follow a U-curve because they are determined by declining density of the rock ore. Finally, thorium. Thorium is the third transformational innovation driver we have been looking at. It is a CO2-free form of energy that has less radioactive waste than uranium, no dual-use possibility, i.e. no nuclear bombs can be made from nuclear power plants running on uranium, less mineral resource use than renewables require, and not the narrow geopolitical supply dependencies as uranium or indeed metals for renewables have. Thorium occurs much more widely distributed, and calculations show the potential to meet even current inefficient energy metabolism for 25,000 years. Not surprisingly, China is trailblazing here as well, and they reported that their first project calculations showed it could cover their needs for 60,000 years. We also need the horizontal part of the ARISE platform. Like any innovation, if there is no regulatory support or societal acceptance, it will not leave the laboratories, as many never implemented brilliant inventions show. This horizontal dimension of the ARISE platform supports the pillars with introductions, experience, optimization and networks to get the appropriate regulatory framing and societal acceptance, as well as the indispensable conditions for success. In view of the earlier mentioned vulnerabilities for Europe, ARISE, Resilience Innovation for a Sustainable Europe, seeks to catalyze this for our future. Finally, I want to say a few things about transition weaving. I found this picture, which in a way reflects what the Sun and its confidence is beginning to accomplish thanks to the wealth of knowledge and experience and the geographic and professional spread and reach of its members. As we know, it all starts with facts, physics and science. But data need context to become information, and connections need trust to become conduction channels of knowledge and insights in order to be able to make wise choices. Thus, it can develop the agency with which impact can be made at systems level and guide behavioral change of the currently living to be the good ancestors that we all wished for as well. Thank you very much for your attention.